Hello and welcome to It's Your Business with Mario Toneguzzi on Megapix Media. Joining me today is Brad Clark, who is Associate Professor of Broadcast Media Studies and Journalism at Mount Royal University here in Calgary. Thanks for joining us today, Brad.
Happy to be here.
Well, when we're talking about the media industry, a couple of things happened here recently. Calgary Sun building, owned by Post Media, no longer owned by Post Media, was sold to U-Haul recently. Post Media itself will come out with its year-end and Q4 financial results here in the near future. So I thought it'd be timely to talk about the state of the media industry these days. What's your thoughts on that, Brad, and where it's at these days?
Well, I try to be an optimist, but there hasn't been a lot of really great news, certainly through the pandemic. When you look at media, particularly what we now sort of refer to as the legacy media, the traditional newspapers and traditional broadcasters. There's a project, a research project through Ryerson University right now that's been tracking the impact of COVID on news organizations, and I think at last count it's over 50 different newspapers or news organizations that have fallen victim to lost revenue, lost advertising, lost audience through the pandemic. And of course, there were a lot of things that sort of led up to the unanticipated consequences of the pandemic that that didn't leave news organizations in a very good place going into the pandemic, but the pandemic has certainly been a catalyst for more bad news, if you will.
Well, let me just ask, Brad, when you look at the state of the industry, and some of the factors leading up to that point, what have been some of the major issues that the industry has faced that kind of put them in the precarious spot that it's in now?
Well, we talk about technical disruption and sort of towards the end of my journalism career, we were moving from cutting quarter-inch tape for audio at CBC and printing newspapers. I refer to them, as my student says, hard copies of the digital version of news operations now.
Yeah.
But when especially when Facebook and Google arrived on the scene, so much of the advertising revenue was streamed away from news organizations, and that was a huge factor. And then the explosion of social media gave people a lot of potential venues to go for other sources of news. So if you look at newspaper subscriptions in the 1950s, for example, we were at a point where houses actually subscribed to more one newspaper on average per household, and now we're at about 20% nationally. So
Wow.
there's been a real drop in interest in traditional media that has been filled through the internet and social media, and that's a big part of it. And I think arriving at a business model that has worked has been kind of a longer process than people anticipated. Some organizations have figured it out and have done well, but they tend to have really well-established brands. When you look at the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Guardian, these groups have tremendous global reach and have actually managed to really boost their subscriber base and boost their operations. They hire a lot of journalists these days. So those are some of the big factors. I think there are organizations that are starting to be established that are native to digital media, and some of those are doing pretty well. And I think there are some models that are coming out that are beginning to work. But when Post Media comes out with their next set of results, I don't think it's going to be a happy story.
And I'm going to come back to these other digital entities in a few minutes, but I wanted to ask you just a little bit about the industry itself the support systems, I guess, that are out there from, it's controversial, but from the
Sure.
federal government, how important is that, I guess, right now for the basic survival of many of these, as you say, quote, legacy businesses?
Yeah, I'm a little skeptical of some of the support that has come for legacy organizations that are supporting, I think, a failing business model, and I think we need to get to a place where we're supporting innovation. That would, if I were in Ottawa, that's what I would advocate. I think the new legislation around allowing news organizations to be nonprofit, I think that's a great starting point. So, for example, La Presse is looking at moving to a nonprofit model,
Yeah.
and that's recognizing the important work that the journalism does in support of democracy.
Yeah.
So I think I kind of like that model better than driving money from government into initiatives that maybe aren't viable otherwise. So I'm a bit ambivalent about that, I have to say, but I think the nonprofit model could work really well. The Tyee, which is
Yeah.
on the coast, is also moving to a nonprofit model, and it's been really successful in the United States. ProPublica, I don't know, they've won like a half a dozen Pulitzer Prizes now, and continue to work in a mostly digital space. And they've established a reputation for really strong journalism. And it started with a big endowment, but if that's an option, I think that's a potentially good one.
Well, you mentioned before about different NGOs. All you have to do is even look in Calgary, right? We're an example. Calgary's business is an example of it. There are others out there like Livewire and the Sprawl, et cetera. Do you see that as the future of these kind of niche media outlets coming out, and particularly, obviously, in the digital format?
I think so, and you see it more and more, and they're increasingly viable. I mean, I'm quite familiar with the Sprawl because Jeremy Classes is a former student of our program, and is helps us out with some partnerships, and he's really managed to grow that. And a similar model is Canada Land that Jesse Brown has put out. It's a podcast. It's Patreon supported, but I think it's been around for about 5 years now, maybe. And he's really managed to grow it. He's added staff. He's certainly added lots of subscribers, and managed to break off with a bunch of additional projects as well. I think there's lots of room for these niche approaches, and sort of in an era of racial reckoning. There's a lot of call for, I think, for diversity and for representation in media coming from BIPOC journalists who often aren't given the same sorts of opportunities in mainstream media. You see a lot of this in the U.S., and there are a number of institutions springing up in the racial reckoning down there that are very viable, and so it's I think the journalism is still sort of figuring out what the business models are going to be. And it's been a longer process. I think dealing with the monoliths of Google and Facebook and social media generally has been a huge challenge. But even now, we're starting to see some governments move towards trying to direct some of the revenue that news organizations have lost back to them with legislative measures like in Australia now.
Yeah. Now, I'd like to get your take on this next question. Sure. And before that, I ask the question, I'll have full disclosure, right? I was an employee at the Calgary Herald for 35 years. was laid off as part of the purge across Post Media, about 4.5 years ago. And people often ask me this question, what's the future of the printed newspaper? Do you ever foresee the day that there won't be one?
I don't. I don't think so. Because I think that there's something about having something tactile that still appeals to a lot of people.
Yeah,
Not everybody. I grew up in Edmonton, and maybe I was a weird kid, but when the newspaper came in the afternoon in those days, I couldn't wait to grab it and pull out the sports section and lay down on the living room floor and go through it. And there isn't the same sort of tradition around that with today's generation. But for example, I was out with my 21-year-old daughter recently, and we were in a restaurant, and she started pulling out some of the free sheets, like beetroot, and I can't remember some of the other ones, but because she was interested in what was going on in the music scene
yeah,
or in the restaurant scene around town. And you still see magazines in magazine racks, if you happen to get out of the house and go into a place that has magazines.
yeah,
But people still purchase them, and see people still access them in the same way people are buying books and hard textbooks. I mean, increasingly, there's sort of pretty good uptake with digital books, but it's not universal, and book sales are still really important. And I kind of look to the book industry as a source of optimism, that people are willing to pay for printed content and written content, digital or otherwise, as a whole. So we as journalists don't need to be just giving away our content, our work, and hoping we'll generate enough revenue to pay ourselves.
yeah. So I'm curious. A couple of things. Do you think in cities like Calgary, Edmonton, Ottawa, there is room for two newspapers owned by the same company?
Um, I thought that just seems like a really weird business model to me, and that was my reaction when Post Media took over the Sun chain. And I know they intended to operate the two publications distinctly and separately, but I mean that pretty much went by the wayside. There, some columnists only appear in one
Yeah,
paper together, but for the most part, there's a lot of sharing of content, certainly of photos, and it just seems like a really, it seems like you're doubling your costs in some ways. Certainly your print and distribution costs. Yeah, I'm not really big into the economics and finances of newspapers. I did work in print for a while, but I have to say, and even as kind of a marketing idea, I think it's confusing for consumers.
yeah. One last question for you, Brad. I'm just curious of what you tell your students. The first year students that come in, obviously with all these idealistic dreams,
Yeah.
about becoming a journalist. What do you tell them about what to expect in this day and age, and what their future might be?
It's interesting because our students come into the program and they have different aspirations than people might think. And I actually wrote an article about this for CAJ's, Canadian Association of Journalists Media Magazine, where I kept freaking out when there had been layoff after layoff after layoff in the news media, and 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 so I was asking my colleagues, what are you hearing from students, and nobody was really hearing much. So I actually started going and asking students, and probably 90% of the students in the program at that time were saying to me that they weren't looking to work for Post Media. They weren't aspiring necessarily to work for the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Star. They had their sights on doing other kinds of work, potentially doing documentary work or establishing their own website to cover a particular interest they have, whether it was sports or fashion or food, and populate their own website with their own content. So
Yeah.
I think kids today see media, news media, as an opportunity to tell digital stories in an emerging way, in a new way, and that's a good thing.
My, the times have changed, haven't they?
Yeah,
I graduated from Carleton University in Ottawa, and the number one dream was to work with the Ottawa Citizen, right?
yeah,
You dial back the clock here a few years ago, so to speak, and that's probably been the number one dream of anybody who went into the industry, to become to work for a major daily newspaper, right? So
yeah,
that seems to have all changed now, right?
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, then. Well, thanks a lot, Brad, for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Love talking about it.
Okay, great. That was Brad Clark, who is Associate Professor in Broadcast Media Studies and Journalism at Mount Royal University. This has been It's Your Business with Mario Toneguzzi on Megapix Media. Thanks for joining us today.